Before the choice ever had a name, life felt simple. Not easy, just familiar. Days followed a rhythm I never questioned. Morning light filtered through the house. Familiar voices moved around me. The quiet sound of daily life filled the space in a way that felt steady and dependable. Family was always close. Not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a constant one. Meals were shared. Conversations were small. Silences felt normal, never uncomfortable. I didn't think about leaving. I didn't think about becoming someone else. Life was happening around me, and I stayed inside it. There was comfort in knowing where I belonged. Home was not perfect. There were worries. There were struggles, but they were shared. And when worries are shared, they feel lighter. I learned early that family was something you stayed with, something you returned to at the end of the day. That belief settled quietly inside me. I didn't analyze it. I lived it. In those years, the world felt small but complete. I didn't feel limited. I felt grounded. English, during that time, was very far away. It existed somewhere outside my life, in books, in exams, in conversations that didn't include me. English was not a tool. It was a subject, something to pass, something to finish. It had no emotion, no connection, no place in my everyday life. At home, we spoke in a language that carried history. Tone mattered. Pauses mattered. What was not said often mattered more than what was. English could not hold that "not yet," so it stayed distant. I remember evenings when we sat together, doing nothing important. The television was on. Someone was cooking. Someone else was resting. Those moments didn't feel memorable at the time, but they felt safe. No one asked what I wanted to become. No one pushed me toward a future. The present was enough. I carried that feeling with me without realizing it. It shaped how I saw the world. Stability felt valuable. Continuity felt important. I didn't think about opportunity. I thought about belonging, and belonging felt natural. As years passed, I grew older, but life remained steady. Responsibilities increased, but the center stayed the same. Family was still there, close, reliable, unchanging. That closeness became part of my identity. I didn't describe myself by ambition. I described myself by connection. I belonged somewhere, and that mattered. English continued to stay in the background. It never interrupted my life. I never needed it to express myself. Everything meaningful could be said at home in familiar words, in familiar silence. Sometimes people talked about leaving, about going far, about new places. Those conversations felt distant. Not wrong, just unrelated. I listened, but I didn't imagine myself inside those stories. My life felt anchored. I didn't feel curious about other worlds. I felt content inside my own. Looking back, I see how rare that feeling was. But at the time, it felt ordinary. I didn't know that ordinary moments are often the ones we understand much later. English, again, had no role in those thoughts. It belonged to the movement, and I wasn't moving. I was staying, and staying felt right. There were moments when pressure appeared, when expectations surfaced, but they passed. They never stayed long enough to disturb the balance. I learned to adapt without changing, to grow without leaving. That skill would later be tested, but I didn't know that yet. In those years, choice was not something I faced. Life unfolded without asking me to decide. And when you are not asked to choose, you don't realize how deeply you are rooted. Family was close. Life was familiar. English was far dot, and everything felt quietly complete. I didn't note that this balance would one day be challenged, that a moment would arrive when staying and leaving would both carry weight. At that time, the idea of choice felt unnecessary. Why choose when life already fits? I didn't know then that comfort can prepare you for difficulty, that closeness can make decisions harder. I was living inside a calm I believed would last, and in that calm, I didn't notice how attached I had become, not only to my family, but to the version of myself who did not need to decide. English was still very far away. So was the question that would eventually change everything. For now, it was only ordinary life, and ordinary life felt enough. The change did not arrive suddenly. There was no announcement, no dramatic event. It came quietly, as most important things do. At first, it appeared only as conversation, people talking about possibilities, about paths they were considering. I listened, not because I was interested, but because those conversations were happening around me. Words like future, opportunity, and direction began to appear more often. At first, they didn't feel personal. They belonged to other people, other lives. My life felt settled. Then, little by little, those words started pointing toward me. Questions were asked, not aggressively, not urgently, casually. What are you thinking about doing next? Have you considered other options? I answered vaguely, not to avoid the question, but because I didn't have an answer. I wasn't undecided. I was unawakened. The idea of choosing felt strange. Why choose when everything already feels in place? But the questions didn't disappear. They lingered, and with them came a quiet discomfort, a sense that something was approaching, though I didn't yet know what it was. At home, life remained unchanged. Meals were shared. Conversations followed familiar rhythms. Family was still close, still present, still steady. That constancy made everything more complicated, because nothing was wrong. There was no reason to leave on, no clear reason to stay. That space between reasons is uncomfortable. It asks you to listen. I began noticing how often people outside my home talked about movement, about going elsewhere, about change. Those conversations didn't excite me. They made me restless. They introduced a feeling I wasn't used to: possibility. And possibility can be heavy when you are rooted. English began to appear more clearly during that time, not as a subject, but as a signal. It surfaced in discussions about work, about study, about leaving. English seemed to belong to the road ahead, and the road ahead felt far. People spoke about it with urgency, with expectation, as if it were a requirement for becoming someone else. I listened, but I didn't engage. Not because I disagreed, but because it didn't feel like mine. English still felt distant, not from fear, but from unfamiliarity. I didn't associate it with my family, my home, or who I was when no one was watching. It belonged to another version of life, one I wasn't sure I wanted. A quiet tension settled in between comfort and curiosity, between stability and movement. It wasn't dramatic. There were no sleepless nights or emotional arguments, just a steady awareness that something was being asked of me, and I didn't yet know how to answer. My family noticed that I had grown quieter, not withdrawn, but thoughtful. They didn't press. They didn't push. Their silence wasn't indifference. It was trust. And that trust made the decision heavier. Because when no one forces you, you have to face yourself. I started imagining small changes, not leaving forever, just stepping away for a while. Those thoughts made me uncomfortable, not because they were frightening, but because they made me feel distant from the life I knew. I didn't want to disappoint anyone. More than that, I didn't want to disconnect. Family wasn't just people. It was rhythm, memory, identity. English stood quietly in the background, like a doorway I hadn't opened. I didn't hate it. I didn't love it. I respected it from a distance. Learning English felt like preparation for leaving, and leaving felt like breaking something fragile. Days passed. The conversations continued. The questions returned. And the space inside me grew not empty, but aware. I realized that avoiding the choice was also a choice. Staying without deciding was still deciding. That realization made everything clearer and heavier. I began to see that life was gently asking me to move. Not urgently, not forcefully, but persistently. I didn't know which direction I would take. I only knew that something had shifted. The calm of earlier years was still there, but it was no longer complete. There was a crack, just enough for questions to enter. English was no longer very far away. It was closer now as a language, but as a possibility. And possibilities change how you see everything. Even the things you love specially the things you love. I was standing between two directions, one familiar, one unknown. Both mattered, and that was the hardest part, because choosing didn't mean choosing between good and bad. It meant choosing between two goods, two lives, two versions of myself. I didn't know yet how to decide, but I knew this. The moment of choice was no longer distant. It was approaching quietly, and I was beginning to feel its weight. The conversation didn't happen the way I expected. There was no serious tone, no dramatic setting. It happened on an ordinary day, at home, with nothing special surrounding it. Someone was preparing a meal. Someone else was sitting nearby. I don't even remember who started talking. That's how ordinary it was. The topic came up naturally, not as a discussion or a debate. Just a passing comment about the future, about plans. I listened as I usually did. I didn't interrupt. I didn't explain. I stayed quiet. Then someone asked me what I was thinking. Not directly, not in a way that demanded an answer. Just curious. I paused it because I didn't know what to say, but because I wasn't sure how much to say. I spoke carefully. I said I wasn't certain. I was thinking about different possibilities. That was all. No details. No conclusions. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable, just attentive. Then someone spoke, not with advice, not with instructions, just with understanding. They said that whatever I chose, I would not be leaving. That distance did not mean separation. That choosing a different path did not mean choosing against family. Those words were simple, but they landed deeply because they touched a fear I hadn't named. I realized I had been carrying an assumption that choosing for myself meant hurting others, that moving forward meant moving away. I had built that belief quietly, without questioning it, and now it was gently undone. No one told me what to do. No one pushed me in any direction. They simply reminded me that love does not disappear when paths change. That belonging is not tied to location, routine, or staying the same. Something shifted in me, not suddenly, but steadily. I felt lighter, not because the decision was made, but because the weight had moved. I was no longer choosing between people and myself. I was choosing how to live, not who to leave. That distinction mattered. We didn't talk much after that. The conversation moved on to ordinary things, but the meaning stayed. In the days that followed, I noticed how differently I carried the question. It no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a responsibility. When shared, is less heavy. English began to appear in a new way. Not as pressure, but as preparation. Not for leaving, but for understanding. I saw that English wasn't taking me away from my family. It was giving me another way to carry them with me, to explain who I was, where I came from, what mattered to me. English no longer felt like a doorway out of my life. It felt like a bridge between worlds, between past and future, between home and possibility. I didn't suddenly become confident. I didn't suddenly study harder, but I became calmer. I stopped resisting the idea of change. I stopped seeing it as loss. I began seeing it as an expansion. That conversation didn't give me answers. It permitted me permission to consider myself without guilt, to move without betrayal. Family, in that moment, didn't hold me back. They held me steady, and because of that, I could look forward without fear. The choice was still waiting, but now it felt possible, and that made all the difference. Years have passed since that choice entered my life. Not as a single moment, but as a direction. Looking back now, I no longer ask myself whether the choice was right or wrong. That question feels less important with time. What matters more is how that choice changed the way I understood myself and the way I understood love. I didn't leave because I wanted more. I left because I needed to understand something about independence, about responsibility, about who I was when no one guided me. At first, everything felt unfamiliar. The rhythm of my days, the silence, the distance. Family was no longer just a few steps away, but they were never gone. I learned that closeness does not depend on proximity. It depends on intention. I carried my family with me in habits, in values, in the way I responded to the world. That realization brought comfort during moments when loneliness appeared. I began to understand that distance does not erase connection. It reshapes it. Being English during those early years was still difficult, not because it was complex, but because it asked me to speak for myself, to explain who I was without hiding behind familiarity. That was uncomfortable, but necessary. I began to see that language is not just a tool for communication. It is a mirror. It shows you how clearly you understand yourself. When I struggled to express something in English, I often realized I hadn't fully understood it in my own language either. That realization was humbling, but honest. I stopped blaming English for my discomfort. I started listening to what the discomfort was trying to teach me: to slow down, to be patient, to accept that clarity takes time. I didn't become fluent quickly. I didn't feel confident every day, but I stayed. I stayed because staying had meaning, now not obligation, but choice. That choice taught me something important. Choosing does not mean abandoning. It means committing to growth, to uncertainty, to responsibility for your own life. I learned that family love does not weaken when you step away. It becomes quieter, more trusting, more enduring. English was never meant to replace where I came from. It was meant to help me carry it forward, to translate my values into another space, to speak without losing myself. Over time, English stopped feeling like a challenge. It became a companion, not always easy, but always present through mistakes, pauses, and moments of uncertainty. It taught me that not knowing is not failure. It is part of learning. Looking back now, I see that the choice was never about leaving home. It was about learning how to return it eternally, to carry home inside me, to stay connected without holding on too tightly. If you are listening and standing before a difficult choice, know this: you don't need certainty. You don't need to see the whole path. You only need to listen carefully to what feels honest. Choices are rarely about right or wrong. They are about alignment, and if English is part of that direction for you, don't treat it as an enemy or a test. Treat it as a space to grow slowly, to make mistakes, to speak imperfectly, to discover who you are when words feel unfamiliar. You don't have to choose between who you love and who you are becoming. When a choice is honest, it finds a way to hold both, quietly, over time.